So sleeping at night was the most difficult of tasks. And since childhood, I could never give in to sleeping without a fight. I had a strong passion for reading, a passion I lost as an adult because the smell and texture of books I so loved, I now try to avoid. My parents would take me to a bookstore where secondhand books were sold. I loved going there. I loved the idea of books, and most of all, I loved finding books with handwritten dedications. They felt so warm and fuzzy to me. I always looked through piles of books, selecting to buy only those I found with handwritten dedications in them. People at the time would mostly give their friends books that helped them on their own personal journeys. So my library unintentionally got filled with self-help books. I would hide those books under my pillow along with a small flashlight. And from the age of 8, I unknowingly, unintentionally discovered a way to understand humans on a more academic, factual level. The second my parents turned off the lights for us to sleep, I'd cover my head with a blanket, turn on my little flashlight, and drown into different concepts, ideas, and stories that grew my understanding further. But during the day, I would find myself getting into trouble. Even though I was and still am extremely loved and cared for, I was misunderstood so regularly and called all sorts of names normally used on naughty children. The close ones took turns on trying to tame me and knew me as an out of control child. And the not so close saw only my angel, polite perfection. It became clear when I turned 11 that something was not right. I begged my parents to take me to a psychologist, but at the time, you needed to fit the TV definition of crazy to qualify for one. Not able to identify the right words to defend my cause, I just gave up on seeking help altogether. Slowly, the books became my only resort in figuring out what was wrong with me. I learned so much along the way, but little did I know it would take another 2 decades to unlock the mystery that is me. As I got older, I took advantage of the knowledge I gathered and got a degree in psychology, then another one in psychoanalysis and the contemporary society. I studied for years and years. I even studied some Ayurveda, Greek medicine, Feng Shui, and any other discipline I could get my hands on, yet I couldn't relate to a single disorder, and I still couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. At university, even though we were taught about autism, nobody mentioned that there were different types of autism, or that a person could look like they were functioning well in society and still be autistic. There was no mention of Asperger's or high-functioning autism. After graduated, I even worked at a school for kids with learning difficulties. Most of the students were either severely nonverbal autistic kids or kids with Down syndrome who faced huge learning difficulties. Kids who needed a lot of help and who could not do much on their own. Seeing that I could do so much on my own, so much more than even some typical neurotypicals my age. It never crossed my mind, not even once, that I could be one of them. My search for answers never stopped. It consumed me. I knew something was wrong, especially because I considered myself a high achiever. And being a sensory seeker, I exposed myself to so much more than what regular kids my age, autistic or not, had accomplished. I knew I accomplished so much more than I ever expected of myself. I kept investigating everything I could find to understand exactly why. 1 minute I could do so much, but then out of the blue, without any warning whatsoever, I would get knocked out and frozen for 2 days and above, sometimes for months, unable to process a whole sentence until time dissolved whatever I felt was stuck, blocking me from perception, thought, and the capacity to feel, make sense of my feelings. During these times, answering phone calls or simple questions felt excruciating. Making simple decisions, such as what meal to eat today, felt like the most daunting of tasks. These aggressively surprising reactions throughout life would put me off of everything: relationships, jobs, passions, songs, locations. I quit, leave, stop everything and everyone all suddenly. I blamed everything and everyone I came across for not being for me and just kept hopping through life looking for one thing or person or activity that would not surprise me with pain. It was only after many years passed and I quit so much, I broke it off with so many and stopped so many things that it started to dawn on me that it could be something other than the fact that I have not found what was mine yet. When I turned 27, I could not move anymore. I could not bear to try one more thing that would leave me in pain. I got stuck in the house. I mostly couldn't bring myself to do basic things such as go to a supermarket. And I started renting rooms from the house to survive and growing my own food in the garden. My bed and breakfast grew much faster and bigger than I hoped, probably because of my constant chameleon smile, my incredible knowledge of people, my incapacity to say no to almost any request, and the fact that I used the space to experiment with different techniques of therapy through gardening, ecstatic dance, painting, writing, Thai, and other forms of massage, yoga, anything you could think of, introducing any method I could find, working with all senses that I felt could help my guests release different types of tensions. I may assume that they also felt just like I did. It grew so fast that even being at home now became intolerable. People just showed up without reservations, and by the second year, I found myself hiring neighborhood mothers and students and running the place that now became more commercial, hiding from the comfort of my room. I would peek through the window to monitor if there was any work that needed to be done and send the team instructions through WhatsApp messages. They knew they could never communicate with me verbally, and they had to send me a WhatsApp message if they needed any answers. I found it impossible to process their requests on the go with so much noise and movement of all the guests blasting through my soul. I found ways to keep respecting my guests by getting into a special character with props and everything, and walking around 1 to 3 times a day to give the impression that I was on top of things. And in between, I would just rock away the pain caused from an explosion of sounds, questions, and other forms of sensory overload because of a simple walk in a space I loved so much around people I deeply cared for. It feels like being a chocolate lover who has diabetes, and these people and this space were the chocolate you could never have. You can only imagine the relief I felt when, after years and years of silent suffering, having so much in me I wanted to offer, and so little gaps in between shutdowns and meltdowns to be able to offer them, I finally first came across the term Asperger's. A whole new dimension opened up for me. Getting exposed to Asperger's drove me into one of my obsessive modes, and within hours of research, I started finding answers, online support groups, and autism advocates speaking music to my ears. At first, it was a huge relief to have an explanation for all that I was feeling. The most important discovery of all was learning that I was not a monster. I was actually autistic. I had caused my family and friends so much discomfort until then due to my confused outbursts. It was one of the most beautiful feelings to discover that I was not alone and that these outbursts had nothing to do with anyone being good or bad, just my inability to process some information and to tolerate some sensory triggers. Slowly, my self-diagnosis hit me harder, and a few months later, I dropped into a depression. Because somehow it was not easy for me, who had worked at mental institutions with the most severe of schizophrenic cases, a person who had worked on very important research with governmental institutions, a person who opened a bed and breakfast right after running a 50-bedroom hotel, to mention a tiny percentage of what I had accomplished. How could I be autistic? For God's sakes, I also worked as a lifeguard, a flight attendant, a private tutor. I performed on stage as a musician. I did almost anything imaginable. Autistic people could not do that, not the ones I knew at least. But one thing I forgot was that I had not been able to redo any of all those things after I had done them. In fact, the only reason I did that much was because I would keep trying to find a way to live, work, and socialize that would not relapse me back into pain. Throughout life, having no idea I was autistic or what exactly was triggering me made it possible to apply to all those jobs and put myself in all these situations. However, after having done them, I had an insight of the pain they caused me. Surviving was exhausting. I would go to the extent of finding a closet in the office that could fit my desk and literally work from inside an actual dark closet with Vivaldi in my ears and my laptop light keeping my eyes where they should be. Or find a hideout where I could drop into an exhausted nap when things got too much. Or I would go so late to work, including when I worked on the plane. I always arrived as the passengers were getting seated. The rest was always easier as it was predictable and a matter of coffee, tea. My previous employers and colleagues, they found me funny, quirky, kind. Sometimes they would reach the office and find their meeting table hijacked because I just happened to buy clay and proceeded on rolling it flat onto our huge meeting table, spending an entire week cutting out hundreds of perfect little round circles for absolutely no reason but to survive the anxiety. They would dismiss it as me being a Miriam and knew they had to give it a week before they could get my attention again. I was always given the office keys as I found it much easier working overnight than during the day. And they never said anything because I always delivered more than I promised on the condition that I get to choose my working hours. I always gave more than was expected, and I felt genuine love for my employers and colleagues. And I sometimes made them laugh with my spontaneous goofiness. And this kind of helped me, saved me from getting kicked out of previous jobs, I feel. Today, after all these adventures and successes I boast of my life, all my capacities feel like they are gone down the drain, and I find myself almost incapacitated. I'm so traumatized from previous sensory overload experiences I unknowingly put myself through. I find it much harder to go anywhere. Temple Grandin mentioned something once that inspires me to keep trying. She believes exposure raises tolerance. So I started approaching what usually caused me sensory overload in a studied, soft, slow manner. Slowly, I could moisturize my brain to tolerate more and more, making life possible again. I feel with all my heart that autistic people like me, with similar levels of autism like me, who do not suffer from learning disabilities or speech delays, we hold the answers to a lot of the problems this world faces. We can do so much, and some of us can even do so much more than the most intelligent of neurotypicals. Where would our world be today without the input of brains like Albert Einstein, Elon Musk, Charlie Chaplin, Temple Grandin, Sir Anthony Hopkins, Tim Burton, Charles Darwin, Emily Dickinson, Bill Gates, Bobby Fischer, Steve Jobs, Stanley Kubrick, Michelangelo, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Sir Isaac Newton, Nikola Tesla, Andy Warhol, and I can keep going on. These are a few high-functioning autistic people known for having changed the world and literally made it a better place. Has it ever occurred to you that without autistic people, this world could have no planes, no electricity, no cars, no medical treatments, no psychology treatments? We would miss out on so many dimensions of artistic expression. And it's true, I might be biased, but I feel there could even be a possibility that humanity might not have survived. I'm biased. Whose brains do you think are being picked in the face of diseases and other world problems? Autistic people, they are known to focus on details. In fact, they can never leave a puzzle mentally if one piece is not put back where it belonged. While neurotypicals in general might find it easier to finish their shifts and get back home, People who are so great at socializing will find less time to spend in a lab. That is also why some of the biggest companies like NASA and Google have certain positions reserved only for people who prove to have an autism diagnosis. Because if a little star shifts anywhere, if anyone can notice it, it will be someone who's focused that much on details. But instead of empowering that, schools and parents and society, they focus their efforts on normalizing the behaviors of autistic people. This slowly strips society from the input these detail-oriented brains were born to offer. Why are we cutting the very wings of the only birds that can fly to reach certain dimensions of knowledge that is too high for other human brain types to reach themselves, just so that these birds look and act normal? When instead we could be creating space for all types of humans to exist without pain, space that allows these humans to think with much needed clarity, to work and fill the knowledge gaps that were left empty by the effort of normalization. Even though having autism makes life very challenging, I feel the problem is not with autism, but with an environment that cannot get over anything that looks a little different. Why should a perfectly healthy autistic human who can speak perfectly and eat hard foods suffer a regeneration and lose this ability at a later age? So many nonverbal kids started their lives with the ability to speak. Can you imagine how much wisdom, development, and knowledge this world is losing? Not because autistic people cannot speak, but I think because neurotypical people cannot listen to a language that is not theirs. Sometimes I feel like it's the inability of neurotypical humans to process information they are not trained to accept, which makes autistic movements, behaviors, and needs seem so unusual that autistic kids are unintentionally bullied from before they can even crawl. Kids incapable of translating these feelings internally suffer to lengths that make them get stuck in so much overwhelm. There's not a second for them to have a mental pause so they can send the right instructions to their brain, such as the instruction to speak. Place that same child in a sensory-friendly room, and you might find a different story. Yet society still insists on fixing justifiable reactions than fixing the cause of these reactions. Is today's world not reflective enough of the failures of this approach to life? People prefer taking a Panadol to hide the pain than fix the reason that gave them a headache in the first place. In other words, when there's a fire on the mountain, is it not better to turn off the fire than focus all our attention, training the only person sounding the alarm to behave with more protocol? You want your high-functioning autistic child's life to lead to a happily ever after for all? First and foremost, believe in them, but more importantly, believe them. If your child screams fire, careful you don't get so stuck on taming the screams, you forget that you need to be putting out the fire. Autism is a very broad spectrum and diagnosis. Its description has never been precise, nor was it ever final. The understanding of autism has been and continues to be a discovery throughout the years. And after continuous changes, starting with psychoanalysis, which started autism of blaming mothers, and then the American Psychiatric Association identified that there was something called Asperger's syndrome when they realized that not all autistic people suffered speech delays, only to replace that term later with high-functioning autism. A long psychological journey forward, people with autism are now understood as people who process information in an atypical way, making social communication, social interactions, and sensory processing more difficult for them. Not impossible, just more difficult. It is difficult to change attitudes and mindsets in general, and with autism, it's an even slower process that urgently needs to be fast-forwarded. I'm going to try to explain what I mean in this way. Back in the day, many years ago, it was impossible for people to really hear women. For example, it was not unusual for men to be gathered in front of a machine and unable to fix it, and a woman pops her head in with the solution. She wouldn't even be heard. And only 5 minutes later, a man would repeat that solution and get patted on the back and celebrated. Today, almost who runs the world? What about Black people throughout history? Is it fair to blame the fact that they occupied the majority of prison spots in the past on the color of skin? Or is it not much more realistic to blame this on an environment that shows what they wanted to see, listen, or hear from Black people? We all know yesterday. I don't need to repeat all these painful stories. But what matters most is that today, the most valued of opinions and highest of positions and most creative of artists' roots stem from Africa. This proves alone the impact the environment can have on people and the benefits of creating space in the environment for people to be able to exist clean and shine their full potential without preconceptions. Let us allow ourselves the freedom to be able to see the kind of education, exposure, uniqueness we can enjoy by not looking at an autistic person and seeing a problem that needs solving, but rather at a radar pointing to the external problems that need solving. Problems in the environment and in the surroundings, lack of exposure to the diversity that is neurodivergent. Maybe neurotypicals are not sensitive enough to identify environmental triggers autistic can feel so easily as harmful. But studies of sounds, smells, shapes, textures, all etc. of our surroundings are proving these screens are in fact pointing to elements that are equally damaging for other humans and the planet in general. Like, for example, autistic people who find bright lights to be extremely painful. But shouldn't they be? Are not more and more people wearing seeing glasses? What if they cannot feel the extent of the damage of certain elements, behaviors, and ways of things are having on their lives? But instead of taking advantage of the knowledge behind autistic reactions and trying to find what the alarm is being used for and solve it, humanity would rather change a perfectly perfect human being so they match their idea of normal. Trying to normalize neurodivergent individuals by pumping them with trainings and pills just because they feel, express, and experience the world differently is unfortunately working. And many, like me, are learning the language and behavior the general neurotypical population is comfortable with. But that comes at the expense of their mental health and anxiety. The only way we can help autistic people from not having to be disabled and impaired in life is if humanity once again stretches the limit of what we think the word normal means. Be attentive to and believe what each child is saying through their words, screams, or uncomfortable reactions. See that they are caused by triggers in the environment, and without those triggers, being autistic would not have to mean being in a constant state of shutdown or meltdown. Making an effort to solve those triggers to allow the child to be able to exist in a healthy environment and gather thoughts instead of trying to change the original natural structure of the child. Every autistic person is different. What triggers one person could be different from what triggers another. Their quirks let them experience the world differently, which can be a challenge as it forces autistic people to have to adjust a lot to fit into a world that is predominantly designed for non-autistic people. This effort is what, in my opinion, is the real cause behind any negative reactions observed, especially in high-functioning autistic people. I feel that just like the power of women, Black people, homosexuals, to mention but a few oppressed groups, started to rise when the environment decided it was time to see that these people are in fact equal and not less, autistic's powers and peace will start to shine when they no longer have to make such an effort to be able to exist in their own natural structure and be included still in society. Adam Walton once said, mild autism doesn't mean one experiences autism mildly. It means you experienced their autism mildly. You may not know how hard they've had to work to get to the level they are. In order to provide more spaces for autistic kids to be able to shine, it is important that at least in schools, more information is disseminated, educating and exposing the general population further on different quirks non-typical humans have. Almost all high-functioning autistic people, especially women, have developed extreme masking skills. And masking is exhausting. And I hope one day this world can become a place where a person's full nature can be presented without judgment, helping autistic kids to exist without having to struggle so much socially or made to feel weird and embarrassed of their difference. As a child, one school skipped me a class because I was too smart, and another school dropped me a class because I was too stupid. I was neither too smart nor was I too stupid. I was just different, and if my difference was celebrated, new knowledge could have been introduced from my own new, unique perspective to this world. Autistic kids can't bear the certain sounds, textures, sensations, but they make up for that with other sensory experiences, such as spinning objects or themselves, or other forms of stimming that help soothe them. Socializing and potential for sensory overload, especially in schools, is so exhausting. It can be very helpful if schools educated all their students, not just their autistic kids, on how it could look like or feel like to be autistic. There are a lot more autistic kids in school in general than you can ever imagine. As I said, masking, especially among girls, is done so perfectly. Many more students assumed to just be too shy or troublemakers by nature suffer in silence than you can imagine. Having unique sensitivities to certain types of sensory inputs can create certain challenges in schools. It can leave a student feeling so emotionally and physically drained they become too exhausted to perform other basic tasks. Autistic people use stimming to keep their sensory systems in balance. However, stimming can look weird, and if a student has to suppress stimming just to fit in, self-regulation becomes so difficult, leading to either a shutdown, or a meltdown, which can shut off other processes like speech, decision-making, and information processing. Providing a quiet, sensory-friendly room on school grounds where students can disappear into whenever they need downtime could be more effective than waiting for the kids' senses to explode, than referring and dealing with these kids as stupid, problematic, or slow. Because some autistic kids find it so difficult to make or keep friends, empowering hands-on activities or different passions could help these students make friends, and it could also help them develop their skills in the future for future careers or adult social life. However, even though helping autistic kids find their passions and what they're good at is great, introducing new information into an autistic child's life should be done extremely carefully. Do not teach autistic kids how to swim by throwing them directly into the deep end of the pool. This will shock and traumatize them, I assure you, and will put them off of that activity possibly permanently. I'm not saying to baby them, especially that you might be dealing with some autistic kids who might have IQs that are much higher than yours. So babying them will only lead to a disaster. All I'm saying is expose these kids as much as possible. Just do not do it too much nor too fast, as you could really stun an autistic person into silence. Also, respect their brain powers. Photorealistic visual thinkers like Michelangelo, who are great at geometry but terrible at algebra, are completely different from pattern thinkers like Einstein, who can solve any math problem but has great difficulty in reading. Some autistics are also great at verbal facts and words, however, so terrible with sounds, unlike other auditory thinkers who think perfectly in sounds like Mozart. If you really want to work on helping an autistic person, first identify which one or more of their thinking types they may have, and behave with them accordingly without pressuring them to empower the other areas that they're not very good at. Taking the subject of history, for example, instead of just teaching history to kids who can learn history, you can teach history to all autistic kids. A photorealistic visual thinking child would find it much easier processing historical facts if they were presented through images or maybe as a play, whereas pattern thinkers categorizing history into section years might be more effective. And if you want to teach history to auditory thinkers, use sounds, maybe the sound of the eras that you want to teach, or this is another whole topic. So it's just to introduce, a few ideas. Let autistics focus on and think from the comfort of their natural thinking process. Instead of pushing children into normalization, let us assess who they are, what their powers and what are, and work with them instead of against their true nature. Let us create more spaces and environments where their powers can shine. Use autistic people as radars who can identify the slightest discomfort and unhealth in our environment, because they carry senses strong enough to feel discomforts that neurotypicals might only be able to notice once they have metastasized into cancers. And for the love of autism, I would like to end with a very short quote by one of my favorite Aspies, Dr. Seuss. Why fit in when you were born to stand out? And thank you so much for what you are all doing and for allowing me this platform to share what I have in my heart. Thank you.